Today's roundtable is hosted in partnership with the Data Innovation Project. And I'm Lulu Van Lonkhuizen. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a member of the Feminist Action Board here at Hardy Girls, and I live in Rockport. I attend Camden Hills Regional High School. It's my first year on the board, and I'm so excited to moderate this panel tonight on data and representation. We know that data drives our world, but the process of collecting data is subjective and prone to bias. Tonight, we'll be in conversation with advocates of all ages that are working to ensure that the voices and experiences of young people, women, and gender non-binary folks, and people of other marginalized identities are included in the stories data tells. Our panelists are absolutely amazing, but I'm just going to do some really brief introductions so we have some more time for the discussion. And we ask our audience to mute themselves to prevent background noise. And also feel free to turn off your camera because this is recorded. So if you don't want your image on it, that's an option. And also if you need any tech support, just ask Shannon or just drop message in the chat and we'll try to help you. Before we get started, we need to acknowledge the land we are on. While this is a virtual event, Hardy Girls Healthy Women is headquartered in Waterville, Maine, and works with young people statewide. This is stolen land from the Wabanaki Confederacy, which is currently comprised of the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac peoples. We encourage non-Indigenous attendees to spend time learning about the ways Wabanaki people have cared for this land over the centuries, as well as the ways Mainers can engage in truth, healing, and reconciliation with the Wabanaki. Now let's introduce our wonderful panel, starting with Torey Dolan. Torey uses she, her pronouns and is a member of the Choctaw Nation. She holds a law degree and a certificate in federal Indian law, and she's a Native Vote Fellow in Phoenix, Arizona. Welcome, Torey. Is there anything you want to add?
No, I think you covered it. Actually, last thing I will say, Phoenix, Arizona is Akmal Otham and Peeposh lands. In the spirit of such a great land acknowledgement, I want to offer my own.
Thank you. Next is Makeila Jamison. Makeila uses she, they pronouns and is a Queens native and a recent Harvard graduate. She's an organizer for the Young Women's Advisory Council at Girls for Gender Equity in New York. Welcome, Makeila. Is there anything you would like to add?
Yes, I also wanted to add that I'm currently on Lenape land, otherwise known as New York City. So if you're also in New York City, then that is the occupied territory that you're on.
Awesome. Thank you. Next we have Ruksana Ruhee. She uses she, her pronouns and is a young Muslim working class Bengali woman majoring in public affairs. She is also a member of Girls for Gender Equity. Welcome, Ruksana. Anything you would want to add?
No, just that I'm also in Lenape land as Makeila is in, and it's just yeah, that's all I want to add.
So thank you. Next we have Ninochka McTaggart. Dr. McTaggart uses she, her pronouns and is a diversity and inclusion specialist with comprehensive expertise on issues of race, gender inequality, and popular culture. She also just started as the executive director of League of Women Voters in Greater LA this month. Welcome, Dr. McTaggart. Anything you would want to add?
I think that summarizes it. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And then finally, we welcome Korey Powell. Korey uses she, her pronouns and works for the Maine CDC coordinating for the Maine Integrated Youth Health Survey. She earned her master's in public health from Boston University, focusing on epidemiology and biostatistics. Welcome, Korey. Any words you want to add before we start?
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm about 40 minutes away from you, Lulu.
Awesome. Okay, thank you everyone so much. Now I think we're gonna move into our discussion portion, and we'll open it up with some grounding questions. And all panelists can weigh in on these. And then I think I'll ask some more panelist specific questions. And audience members, feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat, and we will try to get them later in the discussion. And again, panelists, these questions are for all of you, and this is an open dialogue, so you can just feel free to unmute yourself whenever. So first, I think I'll say the question and then I'll start it off with someone, and then once you're done answering the question, if you just want to pass it off to another panelist, that'd be great. So Korey, I'll start with you. How did you come into your world of research and data collection, and what does research and data collection actually mean to you?
Thank you. So this is my first job out of grad school. I went straight from undergrad to grad school. I studied biology in undergrad and kind of didn't really know what to do since that's pretty broad. And so started looking into public health, and that's kind of where I dove into that. Mainly the thing that attracted me was the investment in prevention. And so you may be familiar, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that really resonated with me. And so I went into public health, got my master's in public health. And I was really interested in infectious disease. And at that time, when I graduated in 2019, there wasn't a ton of demand for that. Obviously, things have changed quite a bit, but I was looking for a job and came across the Maine Integrated Youth Health Survey and thought that it was an incredible data source. I'll probably talk about it more throughout this, but it's comprehensive in that it covers a lot of different topics, and also really impressive in the fact that it covers over 60,000 students in Maine. And that's a lot of Maine students that covers. So both of those were really attractive. So I was really excited to start this position. And so I coordinate the survey. And so what we're doing is collecting data on various different health topics, all the way from substance use, mental health, physical activity and nutrition, assets, adverse childhood experiences, and through a direct student survey. So it's self-report, and it's done every other year. So I'll end there. Let's see, pass it to Makeila.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question one more time? I was just focused so much on answer. It's what does data
Yes.
implementation mean to us? But what was the other part?
For sure, yeah. It means how did you come into your world of research and data collection, and what does research and data collection actually mean to you?
Got you. So when I was in undergrad, I studied social studies, African American studies, and then I also got a minor in psychology. And I was one of the people that decided to write a senior thesis. So I have in my past conducted like independent research on my own. And I would say, to me, I think that I'm somebody who's like a very like perpetual learner. I just love learning things, and I feel that data research are a great way to learn a lot of different things, so long as you're aware of like its limits. So I think for me, it's just really helpful in terms of, learning about the world outside of my own particular perspective, taking in a lot of other people's perspectives to learn things. So I think that that's a big part of what it means to me. And I think that I consume a lot of research in my daily life now, just constantly trying to be aware of what's going on in the world. But it is something, conducting research is something that I hope to do again in the future, because I do want to go back to grad school. And then should I popcorn it, or do you want to?
Oh yeah, thank you so much for sharing, and you can just pass it to anyone.
No problem. I will popcorn it to Torey.
Thanks. So I got involved, well, funny enough, so I went to law school because like a lot of people, I was really passionate about it, but also really bad at math. So I, didn't anticipate so much of my work to involve data, but in my third year of law school, I was a student attorney in the ASU Indian Legal Clinic working on the Arizona Native Vote Election Protection Project. And I was really passionate about the right to vote because I've always been civically engaged. And so, I became really passionate about this project. But to understand the barriers and the right to vote, you have to know the numbers. And so you have to know how many people are registered, how many people turn out, how many people vote a certain way over another. How far away do most people live from early voting locations or polling sites or drop boxes? And so all of those data points kind of became integral to just being able to basically understand the right to vote and how that works. And then there's other aspects of data where things like minority language assistance under the Voting Rights Act, it's all based on a calculation of data. How many people didn't pass the 5th grade on a reservation and how many people speak a language other than English. And so that's all data dependent. That all comes from 2 sources, the census and the American Community Survey, which is administered by the Census Bureau. And so really, like, just the more I pulled on the thread of voting rights, the more I realized that I had to find more and more data. And now I find that data is really important to tell the entire story of voting rights in Arizona. The top numbers I love to give is that 27% of the land in Arizona is tribal land, 6% of the population is Native American. And when you look at the 2020 turnout, yes, on the Tohono O'odham Nation, 60% of registered voters turned out to vote. But when you look at all the people that were eligible to vote on the reservation, it was only 30% of that entire voting age community. So when you take all those numbers together, it tells a really compelling story of the injustice that goes on. And really, I've always been passionate about fighting injustice. So I'll pass it to Ninochka.
Thank you, Torey. Actually, one of the points that you brought up about the census is one of the things in my new position at the League of Women Voters that's really important to us, making sure that folks get counted in the census, and also redistricting, which people don't often think about first. But yes, those are really important things. So how did I get into becoming a researcher? Really in college, I come from a sociology background, and then continuing on through my master's and my doctorate, I studied qualitative research with an emphasis on popular culture and race and gender. So my former position working at the Gina Davis Institute kind of went hand in hand with my experience. So maybe give you an example of how I use data. We had an API study that came out last year that looked at the API community in Hollywood and basically how they were being treated in real life experience versus how their bosses or the studios thought that they were being treated. And as you can imagine, they were very different. So the idea that, what's going on, or it depends on who's collecting the data, right? So I think mainly to summarize, my role, especially at the Gina Davis Institute, was to look at who's being looked at, who's being studied, and who's being given the opportunity to have that chance to be the focus of research. And I will pass it along to Ruksana.
Okay, hey y'all. I came into the world of research and data collection as like a youth organizer, starting like as early as like being in Sadie Nash, and then other various organizations such as GGE and NIRH, where like we engage in a lot of research in our work. And I kind of like, in terms of data and research, I prioritize qualitative data over quantitative data, where like I learned to validate my lived experiences as an organizer. And I prioritize talking about history and lived experiences, which is data that is particularly not valued by people in power, because like all that they care about are numbers. And I feel like it is necessary to talk about lived experiences for marginalized folks, because it validates their struggles and what they go through, and it like attaches humanity to those experiences, and like it's not like pushing yourself through the bootstraps mentality. And like we're like, you know, particularly like a lot of marginalized communities are expected to go through constant trauma without agency to change like your situation. And like I also wanted to kind of like touch a point on like another generalization with like data is like you know, the greater the number or percentage of like let's say various issue, it kind of portrays as more significant, because like sometimes like it's like general like, oh like a minority percentage doesn't matter because the numbers are small, but like it's like when girls of color, like such as like missing and murdered indigenous women, or like a whole like numbers of populations such as like the Kashmiri Muslims are like being like killed and murdered, it's like, oh, people of power like disregard that as being necessary, because to them it's like, oh, the numbers aren't as big. And like when in reality they're like living through unlivable conditions, and people will use small numbers as like a lack of like as a reason to not care. So that was like kind of a point I wanted to make, but I'll pass it on to anyone who hasn't gone.
Yeah, if anyone has any other thoughts, feel free to add them. Thank you everyone for your responses. It was really insightful, because I think data isn't really talked a lot about in the activism world, and it's sort of like a behind the scenes thing that like even I didn't really know about till I was invited to do this panel. And then the other question we have is, do you think of data as subjective or objective? And then why? And we can start off with Makeila.
I don't think that humans really have the capacity to be entirely objective in any situation. Not that that means that data doesn't have its uses, but I think that you can get into a lot of trouble if you automatically assume that it's something that's very objective, because, you know, like Ninochka said, he's talking about how you have to ask yourself questions whenever you approach data about like who's conducting whatever analysis this is, what questions are they asking, what assumptions are they building into the study already before they're doing it, what population are they looking at, what populations aren't they looking at. So I think because data is something that is man-made, you know, it's not going to be objective at all. I don't think it's, you know, I think objective and subjective are more of a spectrum than kind of an either or thing. And I think the best researchers do their best to like minimize their biases to make the data more objective. But I think the biggest thing is just being aware of how the fact that there is a subjective nature to data is affecting the data. I guess that's my thoughts on it. And I will pass to Ninochka. Am I saying your name right?
Ninochka, yeah.
Ninochka, sorry.
Good. No, don't worry about it. Yeah, I mean, I definitely, just to follow up on your thoughts, I definitely think that you're right in saying that nothing is really fully objective. And kind of emphasizing there is still use for this data though, right? So, I mean, with mixed methods, that's a great way of doing things because you have, survey data and you have interviews or focus groups, for instance. And I don't think we can capture everything fully, but like you said, it's a spectrum and we're trying to capture all of the pieces. If you think of it as like a puzzle, right? You're trying to capture as many pieces of the puzzle as you can. And yeah, I guess that I would agree with Makeila on that one. It is definitely depends on who's collecting the data. Because we know in history, we've had instances where data has been collected for not great purposes. So we just have to be mindful on like who's collecting the data, what it's used for, and issues and concerns like that. So I will pass it to Korey.
So as soon as you said spectrum, Makeila, I was like nodding 100% because that was my thought too, was, there's so many different types of questions and data points that like, I'm thinking like, a blood test or pulse, that's pretty objective. But then if you think about one of the questions on the MIAS, the Maine Integrated Youth Health Survey is, do you feel safe at your school? And that's totally open to interpretation of whether you don't feel safe because of a threat of an attack on your school or because of a bully, or is it, something about your transportation getting to school? And so that's super subjective. But the fact of the matter is those students are saying that they don't feel safe at their school, and that's important. So it's definitely a spectrum, and it is really important to know. And I think that it also could be paired really well, like we were saying, mixed methods, like, a survey, tells you some things about a population, but doesn't necessarily tell you something about the individual. And so that's when maybe a screening or focus group getting at like the why behind the responses, that's really important. So yeah, I would definitely echo what you guys were saying. Maybe Torey, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think Makeila, they were right. It's definitely a spectrum. I will say one of the biggest issues I've had with data where subjectivity kind of renders data close to useless for my work is the chosen method of collecting data. So not just the methodology of, how do you dispatch surveys or where do you dispatch interviewers, but just the baseline facts that the community that I serve doesn't have the same access to things that other communities don't. 95% of people on reservations in Arizona have unserved or underserved telecommunications infrastructure. Language barriers are a big thing. Only 18% of reservation-based residents outside of 2 of the largest counties in the state have at-home mail delivery. So most folks have to drive 45 minutes to 2 hours to a post office box to get mail. And so when I think about the major methods the US Census Bureau collects data that impacts substantive rights of voting, okay, it's the internet, doesn't exist in Indian country at the rate needed. Okay, mail, again, doesn't exist at the rate necessary. And then add on language barriers and large segments of the population are totally left off. And kind of one of the most egregious examples of this is with the Havasupai tribe. They live at the base of the Grand Canyon where they've been since time immemorial. The only way to the Supai village is by helicopter, foot, or mule. So you can't drive in. And there were 300 people living on the reservation that were registered to vote in 2018, but the American Community Survey, there were 13 adults living on the reservation eligible to vote. Okay, so what likely happened? Was there a mass exodus of Havasupai people leaving the reservation? No, there was a data collection issue in the American Community Survey, and the way the American Community Survey is conducted is a survey is sent to your house and they say, okay, please respond via mail or on the internet. Well, if I'm a Havasupai elder, I don't read or speak English, and I don't have access to mail, and I don't have internet. I'm not going to show up in the survey. My community is not going to show up in the survey, and there's not going to be a statistically significant sample. And this is where a point of data justice comes in, is the Voting Rights Act doesn't allow you to sue the Census Bureau for bad data collection. The Census Bureau is entirely insulated. So the Census Bureau says there's 18 Havasupai by adults living on the reservation. You don't get language assistance under the Voting Rights Act, and you can't challenge us for it. So in that way, coming back to the point, data is totally subjective, and it takes a lot of advocacy to, get these institutions to recognize their biases. And so that's why I think it's really important to push the narrative that data is wholly objective, and we have to take it as objective, and that science is an unquestionable method of collecting data. But with that, I'll pass it to Ruksana.
Ruksana, do you need a refresher of the question?
Oh no,
Okay.
I got the question. Thank you for
Okay.
checking up. I completely agree with everyone that has spoken. Data is definitely a wide spectrum. It's not black and white. And as the example that Torey has said earlier, data kind of shows that you can't really rely on quantitative research, and they're the accuracy of their numbers, because there is no kind of way of reaching out to that elderly population. It was just only mail or internet. It was an only mail or internet thing. But yeah, so I do believe data can't just consist of it being objective, and you cannot really have binaries either. For example, one of the examples that this kind of reminds me of was in my class, where there's not you can't really objectively measure racism. You can't it pops up in many forms, and it shapeshifts. And when you're investigating a company on their racist practices, it's based on how they treat their employees. You have to read the complaints to the HR or about the company, and you can tell how a company is treating their workers, not just based on their measured output or productivity, but on the experiences that those employees had experienced, especially the ones that have been harmed. So yeah, so there was this example that I remember, there's this Black woman who complained to HR about their coworker using a racial slur against them, and that the HR dismissed it and said that she was just being too sensitive. So a lot of stuff can be swept under the rug when it comes to a lot of research. So definitely I think data as subjective, meaning that personal feelings and experiences should be taken into account.
Awesome. Thank you. That I didn't even think about that before. So thank you all for sharing your experiences with data and subjectivity. And now we are going to be moving into the more individual questions, but as always, other panelists feel free to just add on whatever if you have a thought or a comment. So first, for Makeila and Ruksana, how did being young, specifically young women, wait, Makeila, do you identify as a woman or non-binary? Okay.
I identify as a woman.
Okay, thank you. Specifically young women of color affect the way that your data was interpreted and if it was taken up seriously. And either of you can start whenever you're ready.
I can go. I feel in terms of being young women of color, and how data is interpreted for us is if when young women of color present data, they're I feel there's a stigma where we're not considered as credible as our like white cis males or wealthy person, like those counterparts, because like society is set up to portray people of color as like less qualified or not credible. And it's hard because when you're like trying to prove yourself and make a point, like for example, in a lot of STEM fields, like a lot of women of color are like they're excluded or their ideas are stolen, and they're not like allowed to like speak in these spaces when they have like when there's a lot of like cis like men or like privileged white men that are occupying these spaces. And like I remember um reading about how like a lot of um like black and brown people have come up with a lot of like innovations in the past, and that like a lot of white people just stole and patented their ideas to profit off of them. So like a lot like as being like this marginalized community, we get used to ideas being stolen, disregarded, or being like taken advantage of. And like I feel like in terms of like being a young organizer and like the spaces where I organize, I feel like validated, and like where I feel like I'm able to present my data and research being like completely heard, versus like in workplaces or like in school even, I don't feel like I'm very validated. Yeah, and just like um paving the way for like more young people of color, like queer folks, low income youth, to be in data and research would probably like um change how data and research are being introduced. And um like you know how I just wanted to take it to the fact that often like a lot of people with like a lot of people with like typically cis men who are like scholars and hold degrees like are like as they're seen, not only are they seen as credible, but like you know there's a history of you know these people like manipulating data to their own advantages. Like they have exploited communities for their own gain. And um this kind of like I pay like to give some to give an example, like in history, like the Tuskegee trials that was so traumatic and like harmful for like the black community, like black bodies were being experimented on. And this is why I feel like representation is so important, because when you have um your own like folks representing you, like we can write our own, like we can bring our own data accurately. And like I feel like that is really important, where you like write your own book with your own pen instead of having someone else write it for you. So yeah. And like yeah, just like yeah, that's what I want to say. Makeila, if you wanted to go.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with pretty much everything that Ruksana just said. And I think that what we're kind of getting at right now is the fact that data and research really aren't insulated from the forces of power that exist in the rest of our society. So this question about, you know, whether our data and research are taken seriously as young Black women, really young women of color in general, is just about whether our voices are taken seriously in generally. And largely the answer is no. I think an experience I've had that could comment on this is in my high school, we had some strict policies around dress code, which naturally were only applied to women. I've never seen a man dress coded for anything, but if a young woman in our school wore leggings, if the shorts or the skirt or the dress didn't come like to like her knee, you know, she would be forced to put on oversized gym clothes that were essentially designed to humiliate and embarrass her for the rest of the day. And some women in my high school gathered and started passing around a petition where, you know, every woman that signed it was essentially saying that they don't think that these policies are fair or just, and they feel that they're harmful towards them. And that petition got hundreds of signatures in that very small school, and absolutely nothing happened after that. got the petition, got the signatures, submitted it, and that was it. And, you know, I think that that experience just speaks to the fact that voices of people who do not have, you know, a considerable amount of power in our social stratosphere, our social structure, are not valued, and their data is not valued. And, you know, that's something that affects all people of minority status. And then, you know, being young, being Black, being a woman, and being part of the LGBTQ community, just kind of makes that worse because there are so many different layers of reasons why my voice is deprioritized in our society. But I can list off, you know, a ton of examples where that same sort of thing is happening. The Tuskegee example is a huge one that I'm so happy has become more acknowledged in like common discourse, but it really does not end there. If you want to like get into the medical field and how that has deprioritized the body's health and voices of people of color. And, you know, like something that I was recently reading about was the experiences of Black women when they go to the doctor or have any sign of, or if they happen to be pregnant. You know, maternity rates for Black women are 3 to 4 times, maternity mortality rates are 3 to 4 times higher for Black women than they are for white women. And, you know, there's still this stigma within the medical field. Doctors themselves have on surveys kind of admitted to the fact that they think Black women feel pain less than white women, and therefore they're often not prescribing them with painkillers if they need them, because they assume that they're not going to feel the pain. And these are all examples of situations where, you know, our voices, our bodies, and our data are not considered. And yeah, I definitely think that it's definitely a problem. And like I said, not something that, you know, data is insulated from, because I think a big part of the problem with our current medical field is the fact that a lot of, you know, our procedures are, you know, based on a standard set by non-white people. Or in turn, a lot of Black bodies have been, you know, unjustly used in the service of medicine. Thinking about the Tuskegee Institute, thinking about a lot of innovations that have come forward based on using the bodies of Black women and Black men who did not consent to that.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was so well worded and well said. Does anyone else have anything to add? Or okay, so does anyone else have any experiences of your identity affecting the way you were viewed as a researcher? This is open to everyone. Yeah.
I can touch on that. Just recently, so in my work, I work with a lot of different groups, a lot of different organizations, a lot of different attorneys. And, you know, I was a part of a small subsect of a larger coalition who was poised with doing policy analysis on legislation. And specifically, I was a part of this group because I'm trained in tribal law and federal Indian law, and I can speak to those unique issues. And in the process of being in this group, this attorney in this group didn't want me on the email chain. And he spoke to everybody in the group but me first about it. And because nobody else in the group wanted to approach me and kick me out of the group, he decided to email the whole thread of people saying he didn't think I should be on it. And so, you know, it felt really disrespectful. I felt really slighted. And so I responded to the whole group and I said, you know, feel free to include or exclude my firm as needed. And that's when he responded, oh, I didn't know you worked with Patty, who's my boss, and she's a really well-respected academic. He was like, oh, I work with her all the time. I didn't know you worked together. That changes my perspective. And so when it was just me, Torey, the man never thought to approach me and ask me about why I was involved and his concerns. But when he learned who my boss was, he changed his tune. And I think that's an instance where my age and my gender really played a large part, because he was more willing to accept that I just didn't know what I was doing and I shouldn't be approached as a peer. And yeah, once he learned the situation, he quickly turned his tune. But because of my work and because I have to keep advocating for my community, I have to meet with him tomorrow to represent the interests of my community. But that's definitely a sticking point where identity, like made somebody look down on my data and my input. And I'm very fortunate to have really good allies in the space. I told a friend about it, and actually Adrian's old colleague, Joel, he said, you're worth 10,000 versions of this guy, because this, white guy who just doesn't question what he's doing and assumes he's right, can do a lot more harm to the community than good. So that was kind of an experience I had.
Thank you for sharing that. That is repulsive, that he did that. And if anyone doesn't have anything else to say, we can move on to the next question. This question is for Torey and Korey. And in your experience, what does it take to change the way data is collected? Whether it's the way that a survey is written or the way voting information is being tracked by the state or county, and your experiences with changing the way data is collected. You can start whenever you're ready.
Korey, do you want to go first?
Sure. So the piece with how the survey is written, for the MIAS, we do the survey every other year, and before every cycle, we go through question revision process, which is very time consuming and work intensive, but basically the point of it is to assess the current data points. Are they being used? If they're not being used, meeting with those subject matter experts and figuring out, is there a modification that is needed to get the data that you are using in your work, or is there a better question that we could be using to address a gap that you're seeing in your work? So meeting with those subject matter experts, and that is up to 8 or 9, I think, topic areas that I'm having meetings with to go over all of those questions, each question one at a time to figure out the answers to those questions. And relying on community partners that are actually in the boots on the ground, seeing this work and seeing any of those gaps that need to be filled. There's some barriers to this, especially in my work. The Maine Integrated Youth Health Survey is Maine's Youth Risk Behavior Survey, the YRBS, which is through US CDC. And there are some challenges that we run into with some of the questions that we'd like to change. One of those being what is your gender? And it only offers male and female. Our hands are totally tied, and we can't add on more options than that. We can't change that question until US CDC decides to change that question. And that's really frustrating. A lot of our questions are in our hands and we're able to change them. But that's one of them that we fight with every year. One of the ones that we were able to change this past cycle in 2021 was describing your sexual identity. Prior to 2021, you were given the options of heterosexual, gay or lesbian, bisexual, and not sure. And, if you fall outside of one of those categories, what do? Do you leave the question blank? Do you put not sure, even though you might be sure? So in 2021, we were able to parse out that not sure a little bit and add, I don't understand what this question is asking. I'm identify some other way, or I'm not sure about my sexual identity, which would be questioning. So it's not perfect, far from perfect, but we're getting closer to what we need to be at, what the question needs to look like. And so I think every year we get better and better, and every year we ask questions that are filling a gap that people boots on the ground are seeing. It's not perfect. I'll be the first to say that. There's a lot of limitations behind it, but yeah, I think that sums up my part of it. If Torey wants to take over for her part of that question.
Yeah, I love, to be honest, I love fighting with the government. It's kind of my favorite part of my job. But I've learned in fighting with the government, a phrase that my mom always used to say has come true, is that you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. So we do a lot of relationship building, a lot of meetings. We try really hard to learn, from the local election administrator's perspective, because here in Arizona, most of the power falls to the county recorders, and it's, one or two people with a small team. So we try and build good relationships, and that helps because when you do have good relationships, I can ask for data, or I can ask for more information, or I can encourage them to collect data in a different way that includes the Native community. The other piece, the more vinegar side of the piece, is public shaming. I like publicly pointing out the lack of access to data, doing public records requests to legally force them to give me the data, all the way up to suing, for failure to do their jobs in a lot of instances. And that's where I recognize a lot of privilege and power that comes with having a law degree and working at a law firm, and especially working for a boss who has sued the counties. And so when she's in a meeting, the counties know better to work with her than against her, because the lawsuits she files are always, spot on and usually succeed. But I think the relationship building is a really big, important part of it, because most of my data that I haven't personally cultivated or collected that has come from the counties, a lot of it comes from just good relationship buildings and mutual respect. And when we publish reports on the level of access to native vote, and we point out when things are unfair, and we point out when the counties mess up, and most of the time I find that they want to do better. And so because they want to do better, they're willing to work with us and understand how they can do better. And then every once in a while, you got to go to court. But, it's not the worst.
Thank you so much for sharing. We have about 5 more minutes for Kasha. Wait, again. Yeah, for Ninochka to share. So for Ninochka, you've done significant research on media representation. Why do you choose to focus on this topic?
So a lot of it comes from just my interest in popular culture. Basically, I'm a huge music fan. So my dissertation was actually on Black and Asian gender and race relations in hip hop. So I obviously am a huge music fan, like I said, but I think my interest in popular culture came from the fact that people think it's quote unquote low culture and it doesn't affect people. However, I think popular culture is actually the most impactful type of culture because it's accessible to all or most. So when you talk about oh, it's just TV or it's just music or it's just a movie, getting back to what Makeila was saying about these stereotypes that we have about Black women, where do we think that comes from? A lot of it is passed through popular culture, right? So I think why I like to study media, and that could include news too, because I think how we cover stories is actually very biased a lot of the times, even in news, which is supposed to be objective. It's really important because everyone is socialized in popular culture throughout their lifetime. Like, you can't really avoid it. So I do think that representation matters in that way, as far as who we're seeing, who we, you know, the Gina Davis like kind of tagline is, if she can be it, if she can see it, she can be it. So it's the idea that, you know, if you can see something, you're like, wow, that's attainable for me as a Black woman, right? If you don't see it, then you might feel like this is in the realm of possibility for me. So I think it's really important to have that representation in media that's so ever present in our society. And it can be harmful when you see that absence of it. So if you look at, you know, there's a concept called symbolic annihilation. It's the idea that you're symbolically annihilated from popular culture. It's like almost like your narrative is erased completely. And as you may assume, it's very hurtful for those folks that are erased, right? Because you're like, well, what's going on with me? Why am I not seeing myself on screen? So I think that's why I think media studies and studying representation in media is really important. And we see that now with a couple of examples. I'm thinking with like streaming services. Hollywood, I'll say, has a long way to go. But I think with streaming services, we see more audience-driven content, and we're seeing those services to be more diverse and inclusive in their content. So it's an area of growth, even though we have a long way to go. So I think media can make a lot of inroads, because if you think about, you know, I grew up in Los Angeles, I live here now in a very diverse city. If I was in a city that wasn't diverse, or an area, a lot of the only contact you have with diverse groups is through like television or movies sometimes. So it's really, really important how we're representing folks in media platforms.
Thank you so much for sharing. Unfortunately, we're all out of time for questions. But anyone who's familiar with Hardy Girls, Healthy Women knows that when we hold events such as these Ruckus roundtables, we don't just want more conversation, as awesome as conversation can be, we want action. Just these panelists have shared what they are doing. We want to leave you all with some steps to get involved. Please check out the resources provided from these panelists on our website, hghw.org, to learn more about how you can get involved. And there's a spectrum of action that you could take, and recognizing your own voice and power is an important step in that. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Susie from this event's co-sponsor, Data Innovation Project, to share a little bit more about what they do and how you can get involved.
Hi, thank you, Lulu. Thanks everybody for this incredible conversation. It's definitely left me with a lot to think about and share with my team. So I'm a part of the team at the Data Innovation Project. So we're a group at the University of Southern Maine's Catherine E. Cutler Institute in the Muskie School. And we're so happy to be supporting this event. The DIP works with nonprofit organizations across Maine to help them tell the story of their work. So taking data and turning it into something creative, innovative, understandable. We do this through workshops and events that we offer, and also through contract-based work that we do, leading program evaluation and research initiatives. A couple of ways people can stay connected with us. So for any students, we're always happy to host job shadows. We just did a couple this past month with some undergraduate students. For anybody interested in data and evaluation. Another way to connect with us, we're hosting a workshop next Wednesday on rethinking how to create logic models. So for those of you familiar with logic models, this workshop's about doing it in kind of a more artistic and creative way. And finally, we're about to open applications for both graduate students and Maine-based nonprofits for our DIP Applied Research Fellowship, which Hardy Girls is a fellowship site for this year. So they could speak to that. And to learn about any of these, just check out our website or feel free to reach out to me directly. I can put my email in the chat. And thank you again for having me here and for just bringing together this amazing panel and this exciting conversation.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Our roundtables this spring are made possible by the generous support of the Maine Humanities Council, and at Hardy Girls Healthy Women, we strive to keep our programming free or low cost. So we do appreciate your donations. Be sure to follow us on all social media. You know the drill. And yeah, thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you to all the panelists. Go hype them up in the chat. Yeah, thank you. Bye, everyone.